The message sat there on my screen longer than it needed to. 4 lines, polite, neutral, no drama. I read it one last time before hitting send, already knowing how this usually went. I told my family I'd been invited to a military award ceremony, that it would mean a lot if they came, and that the date was locked. I didn't dress it up. I didn't explain why it mattered. I'd learned a long time ago that over-explaining only gave people more room to dismiss you. The typing bubble appeared almost immediately. That should have been my first clue. My sister Brooke replied first. She didn't ask what the award was. She didn't ask where the ceremony would be. She went straight to the point. She said it sounded like one of those stupid awards the military hands out to make people feel important. Then she added that she already had plans. A show. Tickets she'd bought weeks ago. She ended it with a laughing emoji, like that somehow made it lighter. I stared at the screen and felt that familiar tightness settle in my chest. Not shock, not anger, just recognition. A second message came through. My mom. She didn't defend Brooke, but she didn't push back either. She said Brooke probably didn't mean it like that. She said everyone was busy these days. She said we could celebrate another time. Then my dad chimed in. One line, short and clean. He said not to blame them if they couldn't make it. Like this was a dentist appointment I'd scheduled at an inconvenient hour. I read all of it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because part of me was still checking for something I'd missed. Some hidden effort. Some sign they might surprise me. There wasn't one. I didn't argue. I didn't explain what kind of ceremony it was or who would be there. I didn't mention that this wasn't a participation ribbon or a routine promotion. I didn't say how rare it was for someone in my position to be recognized at this level. I didn't remind them how many years I'd spent working nights, weekends, deployments that never made the news. I typed one word. All right. Then I set my phone face down on the table and went back to what I was doing. That part matters more than it sounds like it should, because from the outside it probably looked calm, controlled, mature, but inside something shifted. Not in a dramatic way. No big emotional speech. Just a quiet click, like a door finally closing after years of being left half open. Growing up, my family never called me the problem child. I was the opposite. I was the kid teachers liked. The one who followed rules, turned in homework, didn't need reminders. Brooke was different. Brooke had presence. She had opinions. She had volume. When she walked into a room, people noticed. When she talked, people listened. My parents didn't say it outright, but everything in our house revolved around her schedule, her activities, her moods. I learned early that if I wanted something, the easiest way to get it was to not ask for much. If a form needed signing, I left it on the counter with a pen. If dinner needed setting up, I did it without being told. If something went wrong, I fixed it before it became a conversation. Adults love kids like that. They just don't always see them. By the time I was a teenager, I understood my role perfectly. Brooke was the star. I was the reliable one. My parents liked to say they never had to worry about me. It was meant as a compliment. It didn't feel like one. When I told them I was thinking about joining the military, the reaction was polite. No yelling, no dramatic objections, just confusion. My mom asked why I'd choose something so hard when I could do something safer. My dad said it was a steady paycheck, which I think was his way of being supportive. Brooke laughed and asked if I was serious. I didn't make a speech about service or duty. I didn't frame it as a calling. I just said it felt right. They nodded. Then the conversation moved on. That pattern followed me into adulthood. Training graduations, first assignments, long stretches where I was overseas or on call and barely sleeping. I sent photos. I shared updates when I could. They responded with thumbs-up reactions and quick texts. Sounds good. Stay safe. Let us know when you're back. I stopped expecting more. The thing about military work, especially the kind I do, is that it rarely looks impressive from the outside. I don't kick down doors. I don't stand in formation for photo ops. My job is to sit with problems until they stop being problems, to make decisions that don't feel dramatic in the moment, but matter later when someone makes it home instead of becoming a name on a list. I got good at that kind of work because it matched who I'd always been. The person behind the scenes, the one who notices details other people skip, the one who stays after everyone else leaves to make sure nothing falls apart. When the email about the award came through, I didn't open it right away. I was between meetings, juggling 3 unrelated issues, and my first thought was that it was another scheduling update. When I finally read it, I had to go through it twice before it registered. Formal language, official seals, A date, a location, a line about guests. I closed my laptop and sat there longer than necessary, staring at the wall like it might explain what I was supposed to do with that information. For a full day, I told no one outside work. Not because I was trying to hide it, but because I didn't know how to hold it yet. Recognition has a way of making old patterns louder. It brings back questions you thought you'd already answered. By the time I told my family, I'd already rehearsed the disappointment. I just hadn't expected it to arrive quite that cleanly. After I set my phone down, I went back to my notes. There was still work to finish, a briefing to prep, a decision waiting that didn't care how my family felt about my calendar. I focused on that instead, because focusing has always been easier than feeling. Later that night, as I washed a single mug in the sink and listened to the quiet of my apartment, the thought crossed my mind that maybe this was simply how things were supposed to be. Some people show up loudly, others do the work. Families settle into those roles and rarely question them. I dried the mug, put it away, and checked my phone once more, even though I knew there wouldn't be anything new. There wasn't, just the same messages sitting there unchanged. I didn't feel angry, not yet. Mostly I felt tired in a very specific way. The kind that comes from realizing you've been bracing for something your whole life without noticing the tension. I turned off the light in the kitchen and stood there for a moment, hand on the switch, thinking about how simple that exchange had been. 4 messages, 1 word from me. And somehow it had managed to say everything that had never been said out loud. I picked up my bag, checked my schedule for the next day, and moved on, already aware that I'd made a choice the second I decided not to explain myself. I didn't respond after that, and no one followed up. The group chat went quiet the way it always did once the moment passed. That silence felt familiar enough that I barely noticed it anymore. I grabbed my keys, left the apartment, and drove to base with the same steady focus I'd trained myself to keep. Still, as traffic slowed near the gate, my mind drifted back to places I didn't usually let it linger. When you grow up in a house where nothing outright bad happens, it takes a while to understand why something still feels off. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic punishments, no doors slammed hard enough to crack the frame. What there was instead was a pattern. Subtle, consistent, easy to excuse if you didn't live inside it. Brooke had a way of filling space. She talked fast, laughed loud, and expected responses immediately. If she walked into the kitchen with a story, the room tilted toward her without anyone noticing it happen. My parents leaned in, questions followed, reactions stacked on top of each other. By the time she finished, everyone felt like they'd participated in something. When I spoke, the room didn't tilt. It paused. People nodded. Someone said, "That's nice," or "Good for you." Then the conversation found its way back to Brooke, or to whatever else felt more urgent in the moment. I learned quickly that volume mattered more than content. At family gatherings, relatives asked Brooke about her life first, what she was working on, who she was seeing, what her next big plan was. If someone eventually turned to me, it was usually with a question that already assumed the answer. Still in the military? Still busy? I'd say yes, and that would be enough to move on. No one was cruel about it. That's what made it harder to explain. Neglect with a smile doesn't leave obvious marks. It just teaches you to stay small. By middle school, I stopped volunteering information. I answered what I was asked and left the rest alone. If I brought home a good grade, it went on the fridge next to Brooke's accomplishments, but it didn't spark a conversation. If Brooke had a bad day, the house shifted to accommodate it. If I did, I handled it quietly and kept going. My parents used to joke that I was easy, that I never caused problems. I think they meant it as praise. What it really meant was that I learned how not to take up space. I didn't resent Brooke for it, at least not then. She played the role she'd been given the same way I did. She knew how to be noticed. I knew how to be useful. Families like that don't usually stop to question the balance because nothing is technically wrong. High school made the differences clearer. Brooke's events dictated the calendar. Games, performances, social plans that turned into family priorities without discussion. If I had something happening on the same day, the assumption was that I'd understand. And I did. I always did. There was a night when I mentioned an academic award at dinner, not a huge one, just something I'd worked hard for. My dad smiled and said he was proud, then immediately asked Brooke if she was ready for her upcoming weekend. The conversation turned. My moment ended there. I remember washing my plate after dinner and thinking, not for the first time, that being proud and being seen were 2 different things. By the time college applications came around, no one questioned my choices, because no one expected to be consulted. I picked a path that felt solid, challenging, and structured, Something that didn't require applause to feel meaningful. Something where effort translated directly into outcome. The military fit that logic perfectly. When I brought it up, my parents reacted the way they always did to my decisions. Mild concern, mild curiosity, no real pushback. Brooke laughed and asked if I was going to start yelling orders at people. My mom worried about safety. My dad focused on benefits and stability. None of them asked what had drawn me to it in the first place. That told me everything I needed to know. I left for training with a duffel bag and a quiet sense of relief. For the first time, the expectations were clear. You either showed up and did the work, or you didn't. No one cared how interesting you were at dinner. No one rewarded you for being loud. Results mattered. Follow-through mattered. Accountability mattered. I thrived in that environment in a way I hadn't expected. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest. While I was gone, life at home kept moving. Brooke posted updates online. New jobs, new relationships. My parents commented and shared and stayed involved. I called when I could, sent messages when the schedule allowed. Their replies were short but supportive in the way people are when they don't quite know what to say. I didn't hold it against them, I adjusted. Over the years, the pattern solidified. I became the family member who was always doing something somewhere else. The one whose absence was normal. When I did show up, people were glad to see me, but no one rearranged anything for my presence. I slipped into the background easily the way you do when everyone assumes you're fine. Looking back, that role shaped more than my personality. It shaped my tolerance, my expectations, my ability to accept less without naming it as loss. So when I sent that invitation years later, it wasn't a sudden act of hope. It was a calculated one. A small test wrapped in politeness. I wasn't asking them to understand my work. I was asking them to show up. Their response didn't shock me. It confirmed something I'd known for a long time, but hadn't wanted to admit out loud. Still, knowing something intellectually doesn't stop it from landing when it happens. As I merged onto the highway that morning, sunlight flashing off windshields around me, I realized how automatic my reaction had been. No argument, no explanation, just acceptance. That was the habit I'd built over decades. Take the hint, don't push, keep moving. The difference now was that I finally noticed myself doing it. I parked, grabbed my bag, and walked inside, already shifting into the version of myself that handled responsibility without commentary. There was work waiting, and it demanded the same thing it always did: attention, precision, and the willingness to carry weight without being asked. What I didn't realize yet was how much that habit had cost me, or how close I was to deciding whether it would continue. I pulled my badge from my bag and clipped it on without thinking, the familiar weight settling against my chest as I walked through the doors. The building smelled like stale coffee and printer toner, the kind of place where decisions mattered more than personalities. That smell still grounded me even after all these years. People assume joining the military is some dramatic declaration, a speech, a flag, a clear moment where everything clicks into place. For me, it wasn't like that. It was quieter, more practical. I didn't join to prove anything to anyone. I joined because I wanted to work in a system where effort wasn't optional and excuses didn't travel far. At home, it had always been easy to disappear by being competent. In the military, competence didn't make you invisible. It made you useful, and usefulness came with responsibility. Training stripped away a lot of the habits I'd built growing up. You don't get credit for being agreeable. You don't get points for staying out of the way. You're evaluated on what you do and whether it holds up under pressure. That clarity was a relief. For the first time, I didn't have to guess where I stood. I wrote home during training when time allowed. Short updates, nothing dramatic. My mom responded with concern and encouragement in equal measure. My dad asked if I was eating enough. Brooke sent jokes and memes that made it clear she still didn't quite take it seriously. None of it bothered me. I was busy learning how to function on little sleep and fewer assumptions. Graduation came and went without much fanfare. I sent a photo in uniform. My parents replied with congratulations. Brooke commented that I looked intense. That was it. No one asked about the process. No one asked what it took to get there. I told myself that was fine. Assignments followed. My role wasn't glamorous, but it was critical. Planning, coordination, making sure the right resources ended up in the right place at the right time. The kind of work where mistakes didn't make headlines, but consequences lingered. I leaned into it the same way I'd leaned into everything else, quietly, thoroughly, without expecting recognition. Deployments stretched time in strange ways. Weeks blurred together, days were measured by briefings, and updates by the steady hum of systems, running the way they were supposed to. When something went wrong, it was rarely loud. It showed up as a delay, a gap, a decision that needed correcting fast. I learned to spot those gaps early. I called home when schedules lined up. Sometimes the calls were rushed. Sometimes they didn't happen at all. When I did get through, the conversations followed a familiar pattern. My parents asked if I was safe. Brooke talked about whatever was happening in her life at the moment. I listened, contributed when it made sense, and didn't bring up the details of what I was doing. Not because it was classified, because explaining it never seemed worth the effort. The military has a way of making certain truths obvious. One of them is that showing up matters. Not symbolically, physically, being there when things get complicated, being reachable when plans change, being willing to carry responsibility even when no one's watching. I watched people earn trust that way day after day. I learned what it looked like to rely on someone and what it took to be relied on in return. That sense of mutual accountability didn't exist in my family, at least not in the same way. At home, reliability was expected from me and optional for everyone else. In uniform, reliability was the baseline. You didn't get praise for it. You got consequences if you lacked it. I preferred that arrangement. As my career progressed, the work grew more complex. The stakes grew higher. I found myself in rooms where decisions had ripple effects I couldn't always see immediately. I asked questions. I stayed late. I double-checked assumptions. Some people found that annoying. Others noticed. I didn't tell my family about promotions until paperwork was finalized. Sometimes not even then. It wasn't secrecy. It was efficiency. Sharing good news had never changed anything before, so I stopped treating it like a milestone that needed an audience. There was one deployment that tested everything I thought I knew about my own limits. A compressed timeline, incomplete information, too many variables moving at once. We worked long hours adjusting plans in real time, catching issues before they escalated. When it was over, people shook hands, nodded, moved on. That's how it usually goes. I called home a few days later, tired but intact. My mom said she was glad to hear my voice. My dad asked when I'd be back. Brooke complained about traffic. No one asked what it had been like. I didn't offer. What surprised me wasn't their lack of curiosity. It was how little I needed it by then. The validation I'd once hoped for had been replaced by something sturdier. Trust from people who understood the cost of mistakes. Respect from colleagues who knew what competence looked like under stress. A sense of purpose that didn't depend on applause. Still, habits formed early are hard to break. On paper, I was fine, more than fine. But there were moments, usually late at night or during long drives, when I wondered what it would feel like to be met halfway. To have someone say without prompting that what I was doing mattered. Those thoughts never lasted long. Work had a way of pulling me back in. By the time I'd been in for over a decade, my role had narrowed into something precise. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there to make systems work when conditions weren't ideal. I took pride in that even when no one outside the room knew my name. When the opportunity that would eventually lead to the award crossed my desk, it didn't arrive with ceremony. It showed up as a problem that hadn't been solved yet, a pattern that didn't sit right, a set of outcomes that could be improved if someone was willing to dig into the details. I took it on because that's what I do, not because I expected it to lead anywhere beyond the next briefing. At the time, it never occurred to me that this work would force me to confront anything beyond professional judgment. It was just another responsibility, another thing to handle quietly, another reason to keep my head down and my expectations realistic. I didn't connect it to my family at all. Not yet. That came later, after the routines had been established, and the consequences of small decisions started to show themselves. When people began to notice that something was working better than it used to. When questions turned into conversations. When conversations turned into documentation. Even then, I stayed focused on the task in front of me. That focus had carried me this far. It had kept me steady when attention was scarce and recognition unpredictable. I walked down the hallway toward my office, coffee cooling in my hand, already mentally sorting through the day's priorities. Whatever came next would be handled the same way everything else had been, methodically, without fanfare, and with the understanding that results speak, whether anyone's listening or not. I set my coffee down untouched, as the briefing room filled, chairs scraping lightly across the floor. The screen at the front showed a grid of data points most people would skim past. I leaned forward instead. Patterns live in the boring parts, and this one had been bothering me for weeks. My job wasn't to be impressive. It was to notice what everyone else had already accepted as normal and ask whether it had to stay that way. Delays that were brushed off as unavoidable. Handoffs that relied too heavily on memory. Systems that worked fine until they didn't and then failed all at once. I started mapping those weak spots quietly. No announcements, no big proposals, just notes late nights and a growing list of small changes that added up to something sturdier. The kind of work that doesn't look like much until it's gone. Days blurred into each other. Meetings fed into more meetings. I learned which questions to ask and when to stop talking. I learned how to present information so it didn't trigger defensiveness. You don't force change in environments like this. You let it earn its place. At home, none of this registered. My parents knew I was busy. Brooke knew I was still in uniform. That was the extent of it. When I visited on leave, conversations stayed surface level. How's work? Busy. You safe? Yes. Good. I stopped trying to translate my world into something they could digest. It always landed flat, like explaining a joke to someone who'd already decided it wasn't funny. One night, well past midnight, I caught an inconsistency that explained a string of near misses we'd been chalking up to bad luck. It wasn't dramatic. It was a timing issue layered over an assumption no one had questioned in years. Fixing it required coordination across teams that didn't love being told to adjust. I brought it up carefully. I backed it with data. I stayed in the room longer than necessary. Some people pushed back. Others listened. Eventually, the change went through. The following weeks were quieter. Fewer last-minute scrambles. Fewer frantic calls. The system didn't celebrate itself. It just worked better. That's the thing about effective solutions. They don't announce their arrival. They just reduce the number of times something goes wrong. I didn't tell my family about any of this. Not because it was secret, but because it wouldn't have translated into anything meaningful for them. There was no headline version, no highlight reel, just a series of outcomes that mattered deeply to the people involved, and not at all to anyone outside the chain. Colleagues started looping me in earlier, asking for my take before decisions were finalized. Trust builds that way incrementally, until one day you realize people are waiting for you to speak. I kept my head down, I always do. There were days when the weight of it all crept in, not fear exactly, responsibility, the knowledge that someone else's bad night could start with a missed detail on my end. I handled that pressure the same way I'd learned to handle everything else, by preparing thoroughly and not expecting praise. When I did talk to my family, it was usually in the gaps, between flights, between meetings. The calls were short, pleasant. Brooke talked about her life with the same confidence she always had. My parents listened, nodded, filled in the rest with what they already understood. Once my mom asked if I ever thought about doing something else, something less demanding. I told her I liked what I did. She said that was good and asked if I'd seen a show she liked. The conversation pivoted smoothly without friction. That was our dynamic. No one meant harm. No one went out of their way to dismiss me. They just didn't adjust their lens. Inside the unit, things moved differently. Effort was visible there. Quiet competence got noticed. Not with applause, but with responsibility. I was given more of it. Bigger scopes, shorter timelines, fewer margins for error. I remember sitting in my office late one evening, lights dimmed, reviewing a report that summarized months of work in a few sanitized paragraphs. It struck me then how strange recognition can be. The people whose lives were affected by these changes would never know my name. And the people who knew my name had no idea what any of it meant. I was okay with that. Mostly. The work continued. Adjustments layered on top of adjustments. Systems stabilized. Processes tightened. A few people joked that things were running smoother than usual. I smiled and went back to my notes. It wasn't until someone forwarded me an email from higher up that I realized the ripple had traveled further than I'd expected. Questions were being asked. Metrics were being reviewed. Names were being attached to outcomes. I closed the email and reopened it later just to make sure I hadn't misread it. I hadn't. Even then, my first instinct wasn't excitement. It was caution. Attention has a way of complicating things. It brings expectations, interpretations, narratives that don't always match reality. I'd built my career on staying focused, not visible. I didn't mention the email to my family. Not that day, not the next. There was nothing to tell yet, and experience had taught me that premature explanations only invited misunderstanding. Instead, I kept working. Weeks passed. More messages came in. Requests for clarification, for documentation, for context. I answered them thoroughly and without flair. I didn't pitch myself. I let the work stand where it was. One afternoon, a senior officer stopped by my office. He didn't sit. He didn't close the door. He said a few things about consistency and impact, then nodded and left. It was the kind of exchange that meant more than it sounded like. I sat there afterward, hands folded on the desk, feeling that familiar mix of steadiness and restraint. Whatever was forming around this work, it wasn't something I'd chased. It had grown out of repetition and follow-through. At home, life went on unchanged. Group chats about holidays, Brooke sharing photos, my parents commenting. I reacted when it made sense. I didn't volunteer updates. That gap between my two worlds widened quietly. On one side, responsibility stacked and outcomes improved. On the other, I remained the same dependable presence people assumed didn't need much. I wasn't bitter about it, not yet. I'd made peace with the idea that some contributions don't translate across contexts. That was just how it was. What I hadn't accounted for was what happens when those contexts collide. When work done in silence steps into a space where being seen suddenly matters, and the people who never learned how to look are forced to face it all at once. At the time, I was still focused on the immediate tasks in front of me, adjusting a timeline, flagging a risk, making sure nothing slipped. The systems kept running, the days kept filling themselves. And somewhere in the background, without my involvement or expectation, a decision was being shaped that would pull all of it into the open. The chair across from my desk scraped softly as Colonel James Walker sat down without asking. He didn't open a folder or glance at his phone. He looked at the whiteboard instead, where I'd left a half-erased flow from the morning. I waited. When someone like him comes to your office unannounced, you don't fill the silence. He pointed at a boxed note near the corner. You changed this assumption, he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. It was costing us time. He leaned back, considering that, then nodded once. Everyone said the delays were unavoidable. They weren't, I said. They were just familiar. That was the first real conversation we had. Not a performance review, not a pep talk. A short exchange about how systems lie to you if you stop asking why. He stood, thanked me for the work, and left. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 minutes. It stuck with me for weeks. Colonel Walker had a reputation for noticing the right details and ignoring the wrong ones. He didn't reward noise, he rewarded outcomes. People didn't try to impress him, they tried not to waste his time. That suited me. After that, he started looping me in earlier. Drafts came my way before meetings. I was asked to sanity check plans that had already been approved in principle. Sometimes he pushed back on my suggestions, sometimes he didn't. Either way, he always explained why. That mattered. We didn't become close. We didn't trade personal stories. What we built was trust, the professional kind that doesn't need handshakes or compliments to hold. When he asked for my input, I gave it straight. When I needed cover to test a change, he gave it without turning it into a favor. At home, nothing shifted. Brooke posted about a new opportunity. My parents commented with encouragement. I reacted with a thumbs up when I remembered to. The distance wasn't hostile, it was habitual. One afternoon, Walker asked me to walk him through the timeline again, slower this time. We stood side by side in the conference room while I talked through each decision point, each trade-off. He asked a few questions that forced me to clarify my thinking. I appreciated that. Clarity improves under pressure. When I finished, he nodded and said, "You don't rush. That's rare." I shrugged. "Rushing hides mistakes." He smiled at that just a little. Exactly. He didn't say good job. He didn't say I'm impressed. He didn't need to. What he did was put my name on a recommendation that went further than I'd expected. I didn't know that at the time. I only noticed that more people started asking for my input, and fewer people argued when I flagged an issue. Recognition inside of the military doesn't look like it does on television. It's quiet, procedural, buried in emails that don't use exclamation points. It's being trusted with decisions that don't have easy outs. It's being held to a higher standard without being told that's what's happening. I kept my family out of it, not deliberately, just naturally. There was nothing to share that would translate. Telling them I was working on improvements would sound vague. Explaining the stakes would require context they'd never wanted before. Walker never asked about my family. He asked about risk tolerance, about failure modes, about how much redundancy was enough. Those were questions I knew how to answer. The first time he mentioned an award, it was in passing. We were walking back from a meeting when he said, "There might be a nomination coming down the line." I didn't react. I'd learned not to attach meaning to preliminary language. "Don't get ahead of it," he added like he could read my thoughts. "Just keep doing the work." I planned to. Weeks later, I was pulled into a small room with a few people I recognized from higher-level reviews. They asked specific questions, not about me, about the work. Why certain choices were made, what alternatives were considered, how we knew the changes had actually made a difference. I answered carefully, plain language, no embellishment, no heroics. When you tell the truth long enough, you stop worrying about whether it sounds impressive. Afterward, I went back to my desk and finished what I'd been doing before the interruption. That's how it usually goes. You don't stop the day because someone noticed. Walker stopped by again that evening. He didn't sit this time. He said the committee would be in touch and told me to expect more questions. Then he paused just long enough to make the next part land. "People don't get recognized for this kind of work unless someone insists," he said. I insisted. I didn't know what to say, so I said thank you. He waved it off and left. That was the moment something shifted internally. Not excitement, permission. The realization that being seen by the right person changes the math. Not because it makes you better, but because it removes friction you didn't know you were carrying. I drove home later than usual. Traffic thin, radio off. The thought crossed my mind that this was what support looked like when it wasn't tangled up in expectation. No guilt, no conditions, just acknowledgement of reality. I didn't call my family. I didn't text Brooke. I sat with the quiet and let it be what it was. In the days that followed, more requests came in, more reviews, more back and forth. I stayed grounded by sticking to the same rules I always had. Check assumptions, document decisions. Don't chase approval. Walker checked in occasionally, never hovering. Once he corrected a slide before it went out and explained why. Another time he let my version stand even though it challenged a long-standing practice. Each choice told me where I stood without saying it outright. At-home plans were being made without me. Holidays, trips. Updates passed through the group chat like weather reports. I replied when appropriate and stayed out of the rest. That distance no longer felt like a loss. It felt like alignment. When the formal notification finally arrived in my inbox, it didn't come with fireworks. It came with an agenda, a dress code, and a list of procedural notes. I read it once, then again, noting the date and location, the security requirements, the line about guests. I forwarded it to Walker and my immediate supervisor. Walker replied with a single sentence telling me to bring the uniform he'd seen me wear once before. That was his version of encouragement. I closed the email and sat back in my chair, aware that this was the farthest any piece of my work had ever traveled from the room it started in. I wasn't thinking about speeches or photos. I was thinking about logistics, timing, who needed to be where. And for the first time in years, I thought briefly about who I might invite. I stared at the guest line longer than the rest of the email combined. Everything else made sense. Location, time, uniform, security notes written in that dry, overly careful tone the military loves. The guest section was the only part that asked something from me instead of telling me what to do. You may invite up to 4 guests, 4 seats, a small number that somehow felt heavy. My first instinct was to leave it blank. Not out of spite, out of efficiency. Bringing people who didn't understand the environment meant more explaining, more logistics, more emotional noise on a day that already came with enough structure. I'd attended ceremonies before. I knew how it worked. The waiting, the standing, the long stretches where nothing happened, and then everything did. I imagined my parents shifting in their seats, whispering questions, checking the program for cues. I imagined Brooke scanning the room bored, wondering how long it would take. None of that felt compatible with what the day was supposed to be. I closed the email and went back to work. That lasted about an hour. The idea came back while I was reviewing a draft that didn't need reviewing. I caught myself rereading the same paragraph and stopped. The question wasn't logistical, it was personal. And I don't like those because they don't come with clean answers. Inviting my family wouldn't change the ceremony. It wouldn't make the recognition more or less legitimate. It would only test something I'd been pretending not to care about. I told myself I was past that I didn't need them there, that this was my career, my work, my life, all true. And still the thought lingered. I didn't call anyone to talk it through. That's never been my style. I walked the perimeter of the building instead, letting the cold air clear my head. Sometimes decisions sort themselves out when you stop trying to force them. By the time I got back to my desk, I'd made up my mind without quite admitting it to myself. I reopened the email and scrolled back to the guest section. 4 seats. I thought about my parents first, not as a unit, but individually. My mom's habit of trying to smooth things over, my dad's way of staying quiet until a conclusion had already been reached. Neither of them meant harm. They just followed momentum, and momentum rarely moved in my direction. Then I thought about Brooke, about how she filled rooms without trying, about how she'd laughed when I joined the military not because she was cruel, but because she couldn't imagine wanting something that didn't come with immediate payoff. Inviting them wouldn't be a plea. It would be information, an opportunity, one I'd offered before in smaller ways without much result. I typed the message carefully. No emotional framing, no build-up. I told them the date, the location, and that I'd be receiving a military award. I said it would mean a lot to me if they could attend. I didn't oversell it. I didn't downplay it either. Before sending, I read it once more, looking for anything that sounded like an apology. There wasn't any. Good. I hit send and set my phone aside. For the next few days, I focused on preparation. The uniform needed minor adjustments. Nothing dramatic, just details, creases, placement. Things that mattered more to me than they probably should have. When you don't crave attention, you learn to control the few moments when it's unavoidable. Walker stopped by once to ask if I had everything I needed. I said yes. He nodded and told me to let his office know if anything changed. That was it. At night, the invitation sat there unanswered. I noticed it in passing the way you notice weather through a window. A fact. Not a distraction. When the replies came, they came fast. Brooke responded first. She didn't ask what kind of award it was or what it represented. She said it sounded like one of those things the military does to pat itself on the back. She said she already had plans. Tickets to a show she'd been excited about. She added that she couldn't believe I expected everyone to drop things for a ceremony. My mom followed with a message that tried to soften the edges. She said Brooke didn't mean it that way. She said she wished she could make it work. She said everyone's schedules were complicated right now. Then my dad weighed in. One sentence. He said not to blame them if they couldn't make it. I read the messages once, then again, not because they were confusing, but because they landed with a strange kind of clarity. There was no anger in them, no hesitation, just certainty. I didn't feel embarrassed. I didn't feel small. I felt tired. I typed my response without thinking too hard about it. One word. All right, no punctuation, no follow-up. Then I set my phone face down and let the conversation end there. The rest of the week moved forward like any other. Meetings, checklists, a final walkthrough of the ceremony schedule. My name printed cleanly on the program. Seeing it there felt surreal in a way I didn't dwell on. I'd learned not to linger on moments until they were already behind me. I didn't bring the family situation up with anyone at work. There was nothing to explain. People attend these things alone all the time. It's not unusual. It's not tragic. It just is. Still, the quiet after that exchange felt different from the quiet I was used to. This wasn't the background hum of being overlooked. It was the silence that comes after a choice has been made and acknowledged even if no one says it out loud. I packed the uniform the night before the ceremony, checking everything twice out of habit. Shoes shined, insignia secured. No last-minute scrambling. Control is easier when you prepare early. As I zipped the garment bag closed, I thought briefly about the empty seats that would be assigned to my name. I didn't picture faces in them. I pictured space, clean, neutral, uncomplicated. On the drive to the hotel, traffic moved steadily the city, doing what it always does regardless of individual milestones. I followed the GPS, merged when I needed to, parked where I was told. The building rose up in front of me, all glass and symmetry, temporary and official at the same time. Inside, staff moved with practiced efficiency. Badges were checked, phones were collected, directions were given in short, clear phrases. I fell into step easily. This was a language I spoke fluently. In the elevator mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself in uniform and barely recognized the person looking back. Not because she looked different, but because she looked settled, like someone who had stopped negotiating her own presence. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the corridor leading toward the staging area, aware of the low murmur of voices ahead. The schedule said where I needed to be, and when. I followed it without hesitation, the day unfolding exactly as planned, regardless of who was or wasn't watching. I adjusted the strap on my bag, As I walked down the corridor, the fabric brushing against my sleeve in a steady rhythm. The building was already alive with movement, people stepping around each other with the quiet urgency that comes from knowing exactly where they're supposed to be. I checked my phone once out of habit, more than hope. Nothing new. The screen went dark again. Choosing not to respond felt different than being ignored. It wasn't passive, it was deliberate. I'd said what I needed to say, and I wasn't going to negotiate it down to something more comfortable for everyone else. The thing about my family's response wasn't that it surprised me. It was how easily it fit into a pattern I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Brooke didn't just say no. She dismissed the entire idea, waved it away like it was an inconvenience she shouldn't have had to consider. My parents didn't challenge her. They didn't step in. They simply followed the path of least resistance, the one that required the least adjustment. They'd chosen something else, and they'd done it without hesitation. I took a seat in the waiting area reserved for honorees, nodding to a few familiar faces. Conversations drifted around me, neutral topics, logistics, light jokes about parking and security. No one asked who I'd brought with me. No one assumed I needed company. That was a relief. I thought back to the wording of Brooke's message, not because it hurt, but because it clarified things. We don't have time. Not I can't make it. Not I'm sorry. Time is a choice. Saying you don't have it means you've already decided where it belongs. My parents' messages echoed the same sentiment in softer language. Schedules, conflicts, don't blame us. None of it acknowledged the invitation itself as something worth rearranging for. None of it acknowledged me. I wasn't angry. Anger requires expectation. I was past that. Instead, I felt something closer to resolve. The kind that settles in quietly when you stop asking a question you've already answered too many times. I'd offered them a clear moment. They'd declined it just as clearly. The coordinator stepped into the room and called a few names, mine included. We stood and followed her down another hallway, the carpet absorbing our footsteps. She ran through the schedule in a low voice, pointing out where we'd line up, where we'd wait, when we'd move. Everything was precise, predictable. I appreciated that. As we stopped near the stage entrance, I caught my reflection in a darkened screen. The uniform sat exactly the way it should. No loose edges, no distractions. I looked like someone who belonged there, which made the absence of my family feel less personal and more factual. They weren't here because they hadn't chosen to be. That thought stayed with me as the program began. Applause filtered through the curtain, muffled but steady. Names were read. Achievements summarized in clean, restrained language. No embellishment, no emotion, just acknowledgement. I listened present but detached, the way you get when you've trained yourself not to anticipate outcomes. My mind wandered briefly to where my family might be at that moment. Brooke probably getting ready, checking her outfit, deciding how early to arrive so she wouldn't miss anything. My parents likely already in the car or settling into their plans, convinced they'd done nothing wrong. I didn't resent them for it. Resentment keeps you tied to the thing you're trying to move past. When my name was announced as upcoming, the coordinator touched my elbow lightly, a simple cue. I nodded and took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment without letting it tip into something heavier. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone who wasn't here. The speech before mine wrapped up. Applause rose again. I stood where I was supposed to stand, hands relaxed at my sides, listening for the cadence that told me it was time to move. The host's voice carried through the room, practiced and neutral, introducing the next recognition. As I stepped forward, the lights shifted just enough to wash out the edges of the crowd. Faces blurred together. All I could see clearly was the podium and the path leading to it. The rest fell away, which made it easier to focus. I wasn't thinking about my family then. I wasn't thinking about Brooke's laugh or my parents' silence. I was thinking about the work, the hours, the decisions that had brought me here. The people who had relied on those decisions without ever knowing my name. That was enough. The applause faded into a background hum as I took my place, accepting the handshake, the formal acknowledgement. The moment passed quickly, the way all moments do when you don't cling to them. I returned to my seat with the same measured steps I'd taken going up. When I sat down, my phone buzzed once in my bag. I ignored it. Whatever it was could wait. Around me, the ceremony continued. More names, more applause. The rhythm held steady. I stayed present, hands folded, posture relaxed, letting the process move without interference. It wasn't until later, when the formal program gave way to quieter movement and conversation, that I allowed myself to register the full weight of my family's choice. Not emotionally, practically. They hadn't just skipped an event. They'd skipped an opportunity to see me in a context that mattered. They'd chosen familiarity over understanding, comfort over curiosity. And they'd done it without needing any justification beyond convenience. I checked my phone, then scrolling briefly through notifications. Nothing from them yet. No last-minute change of heart. No apologies, just the same silence that had followed my all right. That silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt definitive. I stood and followed the flow of people toward the exit, the evening stretching ahead in clean lines. Whatever came next would happen whether they were part of it or not. And for the first time, that fact didn't feel like something to mourn. I followed the line of honorees into the ballroom, the sound changing as soon as the doors opened. Applause, conversation, the low echo of a large room filled with people who understood exactly why they were there. The lighting was bright without being theatrical. Flags stood where they were supposed to stand. Everything had a place, including me. I found my seat and sat down, hands resting loosely in my lap. The chair beside me stayed empty. So did the one on the other side. I noticed it without attaching anything to it. Empty chairs aren't symbols when you've spent enough time working alone. They're just furniture. Colonel Walker took a seat a few rows ahead. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. His presence registered the way steady things do without announcement. A few colleagues nodded at me as they passed. Quiet acknowledgement, no commentary. The program moved forward on schedule. Introductions were brief. Speakers stuck to their notes. No one tried to turn it into a spectacle. I appreciated that. This wasn't a night for dramatic pauses or swelling music. It was a night for clean facts and clear outcomes. As names were read, I listened carefully, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Each citation represented years of work, compressed into a paragraph. It reminded me how easily effort disappears once the result is achieved. You don't see the hours behind a decision when the decision works. When my name came up again, this time as the recipient, I stood smoothly and walked to the stage without rushing. The path felt longer than it looked, not because of nerves, but because the room seemed to narrow around the moment. Cameras tracked movement with soft mechanical sounds. I ignored them. The citation was read in the same even tone as the others, specific enough to matter, general enough to stay appropriate. It mentioned improvements, coordination, measurable impact. It didn't mention the nights I stayed late or the arguments I'd had to navigate to make those improvements happen. That was fine. Those details didn't belong on a stage. I accepted the award, shook the required hands, and faced the audience for the brief moment protocol demanded. The applause rose and settled. I nodded once and stepped back, returning to my seat without looking for anyone in particular. Sitting down, I felt the weight of the medal through the fabric of my uniform. Not heavy, just present. A reminder that the work had been acknowledged, whether or not anyone else had chosen to witness it. The rest of the ceremony continued around me. I stayed focused, aware of the cameras, but not distracted by them. My phone remained in my bag, silent and irrelevant. For the duration of the program, my world narrowed to the room, the process, the shared understanding among the people there. During a short break, I stood near the back with a glass of water, listening to fragments of conversation. People talked shop, nothing personal, nothing performative. Someone mentioned an upcoming review. Someone else joked about how early they'd had to get up. Normalcy has a way of grounding you even on nights that are supposed to feel special. I caught sight of my reflection in a mirrored panel and paused for a second. The uniform fit the way it always had. The expression on my face was calm, not proud, not tense, just steady. I looked like someone who belonged in that room because I did. The coordinator signaled that it was time to resume. I returned to my seat, noting again the empty chairs beside me. Still neutral, still just space. As the final recognitions wrapped up, the room shifted into a looser configuration. People stood stretched, began to mingle. I stayed where I was for a moment, letting the movement happen around me. There was no rush. The schedule had been followed. The obligation met. Colonel Walker approached, then holding 2 cups. He handed one to me without comment. Water, no ceremony. He stood beside me, facing the room. Well done, he said quietly. Thank you, I replied. He nodded once, like that settled it, and moved on to speak with someone else. The exchange took less than 10 seconds. It meant more than any speech could have. I took a sip of water and finally reached for my phone. It had buzzed at some point during the ceremony. I hadn't noticed. I checked the screen, several missed notifications stacked together, text messages, calls, all from the same 3 contacts. I didn't open them right away. The room around me continued to empty. Staff began their quiet cleanup, practiced and efficient. Chairs were pushed in, programs were collected. The night moved forward without waiting for anyone's emotional processing. I stepped out into the hallway, the air cooler there, the noise dropping off abruptly. I leaned against the wall for a second, not because I needed support, but because it gave me space to think. I knew without reading a single word what those messages would say. I knew the tone before I saw it. Shock, excitement, a sudden interest that hadn't existed a few hours earlier, the realization that something important had happened somewhere they hadn't been. I slid the phone back into my pocket without opening anything. Outside, the city carried on. Traffic moved. Lights changed. People who had no idea who I was or what had just happened passed by without looking twice. That anonymity felt familiar, almost comforting. I walked toward the exit at an unhurried pace, metal-secured jacket straight. No one stopped me. No one needed to. As I reached the doors, one of the large screens in the lobby caught my attention. It was showing a delayed feed from the ceremony cycling through highlights. I watched for a moment as a name I recognized appeared, followed by an image of myself on the stage. I didn't linger. I already knew how it looked. I stepped outside and took a full breath, the night air sharp and clear. The event had unfolded exactly as planned, regardless of who had been there to witness it. I adjusted the strap of my bag and headed toward my car. The phone still quiet in my pocket, the weight of the evening settling into something solid and manageable as I moved forward. The drive back took longer than it should have, traffic slowing for no clear reason. Red lights reflected across the windshield in steady pulses. I let the radio play low, not really listening, my mind still calibrated to the rhythm of the ceremony. Protocol has a way of lingering after it's over. At a stoplight, my phone vibrated again in the center console. I ignored it. Whatever was waiting there wasn't urgent in the way I understood urgency. Nothing was on fire. No one needed an immediate decision. It could wait. I pulled into the garage and parked, engine ticking softly as it cooled. Before getting out, I checked the screen at last. The notifications had multiplied. Missed calls stacked on top of each other. Text previews filled the display without me opening anything. My sister's name appeared more than once. I locked the phone and went upstairs. Inside my apartment, everything was exactly where I'd left it. Quiet, neutral. I set my bag down, took off my jacket, and placed the metal carefully on the counter. The metal caught the overhead light briefly, then settled into stillness. Only then did I sit and unlock my phone. The first messages came in bursts. My mom's texts were long, rushed, full of capital letters and exclamation points that felt out of place coming from her. She wrote about screens, about people turning around, about someone asking if she was related to the woman being honored on television. My dad's messages were shorter, sent closer together. He mentioned the venue, said the feed had come on during a break, said people around them had started pointing. He wrote that it had been unexpected, that they hadn't known it would be broadcast like that. Brooke's texts came last. They were fast and uneven, like she was typing while talking. She wrote about how wild it had been to see my face pop up, how everyone around them had gone quiet, how someone behind her had said my name out loud like it was familiar. She didn't mention the invitation. I scrolled slowly, letting the timestamps line up in my head. The messages started right around the time the ceremony would have reached the main recognitions. Right when my name would have appeared on the screen. Right when they would have realized what they'd skipped. I pictured it without trying too hard. The crowd, the lights dimming, the sudden shift from music or ads to a formal feed, my uniform filling the screen above their heads. My name displayed cleanly without commentary. I imagined the questions that followed, the glances, the subtle pause when people try to decide whether to say something or not. Public moments have a way of stripping excuses down to their bones. No one had warned them. No one had softened the reveal. It hadn't come with context or explanation. Just facts presented plainly, the way the military does everything. They'd seen me the same way everyone else had. Without filters, without family shorthand, without the ability to downplay it. As I kept scrolling, the tone shifted. Initial shock gave way to something else. Pride, maybe, or performance. My mom talked about how proud she felt. My dad mentioned how impressive it had looked. Brooke wrote about how she always knew I'd do something important, the words coming out a little too smooth to feel spontaneous. I stopped there. The change was familiar. It was the same pivot I'd seen before, just amplified. When something carries social weight, it becomes easier to claim proximity to it. When other people validate what you dismissed, it suddenly feels safe to endorse. I didn't respond. I set the phone down and stood stretching the stiffness from my shoulders. The apartment felt smaller than usual, not because it had changed, but because I had. There's a difference between being alone and being unclaimed. A few minutes later, the phone buzzed again. A call this time. Brooke. I let it ring. Another call followed. Then my mom. Then my dad. The sequence repeated like they were coordinating without saying so. I didn't pick up any of them. I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter, listening to the muted hum of the city outside. Somewhere across town, they were probably still talking about it, replaying the moment, reconstructing the story in a way that made sense to them. From their perspective, it probably felt sudden, like something big had happened out of nowhere. From mine, it was the inevitable collision of years of quiet work and one very public screen. I picked up the phone again, not to reply, but to read more closely. Details emerged between the lines. My mom mentioned how someone nearby had taken out their phone to record the screen. My dad wrote that a stranger had asked what branch I was in. Brooke complained that people kept looking at her like she should explain something. That last part stuck with me. Explain what that they'd chosen, something else, that they'd laughed it off, that they'd decided my presence wasn't worth adjusting their plans for, until a room full of strangers decided otherwise. There was nothing to explain. The facts spoke clearly enough. Another message came through from Brooke, shorter this time. She asked why I hadn't said anything about the broadcast. As if I'd withheld critical information, as if the responsibility had been mine to manage their expectations. I didn't answer that either. I sat down on the couch and finally allowed myself to feel the weight of the moment, not as vindication, but as confirmation. This wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. I hadn't orchestrated anything. I hadn't set them up. I'd simply stepped out of the way and let reality arrive on its own schedule. The phone buzzed again, my mom this time asking if we could talk. She said she just wanted to hear my voice. She said it had been a lot to process. I considered it. Then I typed a brief reply, careful with each word. I said I'd made it home safe. I said it had been a long day. I said I'd talk later. That was true. I didn't add anything else. No reassurance. No explanations. No invitations to rewrite the narrative while it was still fresh. After that, the messages slowed. The calls stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same kind as before. This one had edges, shape. It had been earned. I picked up the metal from the counter and turned it once in my hand. The surface was cool, smooth, unremarkable in a way that felt right. Recognition doesn't change the work. It just changes who notices. I placed it back down and turned off the kitchen light. Before heading to bed, I checked the newsfeed briefly. A short clip from the ceremony had already been uploaded. Nothing flashy, just a segment among others. My name appeared once, then disappeared as the next honoree took the screen. Somewhere out there, people who'd never met me would scroll past it without stopping. And somewhere else, my family would keep replaying it, trying to reconcile the version of me they'd just seen with the one they thought they knew. I set the phone face down and walked toward the bedroom, aware that whatever they were feeling now had less to do with me and more to do with the moment they'd been forced to witness. I didn't need to participate in that processing. The night settled into quiet again, the kind that doesn't ask questions or demand resolution. I lay down and let it hold the image of that screen, hovering somewhere in the city, doing exactly what it was designed to do, showing what was already there, whether anyone was ready for it or not. I woke up before my alarm, the room still dark and quiet. My phone was on the nightstand where I'd left its screen face down. I didn't need to flip it over to know there would be messages waiting. I made coffee first. Some habits exist to keep you from reacting too fast. When I finally checked, the tone had shifted overnight. My mom's texts were longer now, carefully worded like she was drafting something she might show to someone else later. She talked about pride, about how emotional it had been to see me honored, about how she wished she'd understood sooner. None of it mentioned the invitation they'd declined. My dad sent a message that tried to sound practical. He said people had been asking questions, neighbors, friends, someone from his work. He said he hadn't known what to say at first. He said it had been impressive. Brooke's messages changed the most. The sarcasm was gone. In its place was enthusiasm that felt a little too quick to settle. She wrote about how she'd always known I was capable of big things. She said it made sense now, seeing it all laid out like that. She asked if there were photos she could share. That last part made me pause. I set the phone down again and stared at the steam rising from my mug. This wasn't reconciliation, it was recalibration. They weren't responding to me. They were responding to the version of me they'd seen validated by other people. The rest of the morning followed the same pattern. More messages, different phrasing, same energy. My mom suggested we all get together soon to celebrate. My dad wondered if the local paper might want a quote. Brooke sent a draft caption she'd already written something about family pride and believing in each other. I didn't reply to any of it right away. At work, no one treated me differently. That was a relief. A few people nodded. Someone said congratulations in passing. Then it was back to business. Reports still needed reviewing, decisions still needed making. The work didn't care about last night. During a meeting, my phone buzzed again. I silenced it without looking. I knew what was coming next. The initial shock had worn off. Now they were trying to figure out how to fit themselves into the story. By lunch, my mom called. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message saying she just wanted to talk, that everything felt different now that she thought we could clear the air. Clear the air of what nothing new had been said. Nothing old had been addressed. The only thing that had changed was visibility. I thought about how often that had happened before, just on a smaller scale. When a teacher praised me in front of them. When a supervisor mentioned my name. Each time there was a brief surge of attention, a moment of pride, followed by a return to normal once the spotlight moved on. This was the same pattern, just louder. Later that afternoon, Brooke tried again. This time she called. I answered, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to hear how she'd frame it out loud. She didn't ease into it. She launched straight into how crazy the night had been, how unexpected, how everyone around her had been impressed. She said she'd never seen anything like it. She laughed a little breathless and said she guessed she'd underestimated things, not me. She asked why I hadn't told them it would be broadcast like that. I let the silence sit for a second before answering. Then I said I'd told them everything they needed to know. She pushed back lightly, said it would have helped to have more context, said she might have rearranged things if she'd known. That was the moment the picture came into focus. I told her the invitation had been the context. I told her I hadn't hidden anything. I told her I hadn't thought it was necessary to convince anyone. She went quiet, then shifted gears. She said she was proud of me. She said family should stick together. She said we should celebrate. I ended the call politely and without committing to anything. The messages didn't stop after that. They just evolved. My mom sent a link to a short article that mentioned the ceremony. My dad forwarded a text from someone asking if they were related to me. Brooke tagged me in a throwback photo from years ago, with a caption about always believing in her little sister. I removed the tag. That action triggered another round of messages. Confusion, hurt. Brooke asked why I'd done that. My mom said it felt unnecessary. My dad said people were just excited. Excited about what? Not the years of work. Not the nights I'd spent solving problems no one noticed. They were excited about the reaction, about how it looked, about what it said to other people. I sat at my desk and typed a response I deleted twice before sending. I kept it short, direct. I said I wasn't comfortable with my work or image being used publicly without my consent. I said the ceremony wasn't content. I said I needed some space. The typing bubbles appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then reappeared. My mom replied first. She said she didn't understand why I was making this difficult. She said they were just proud. She said I should let them enjoy the moment. My dad followed. He said I was overthinking it. He said I was reading too much into things. He said it wasn't fair to shut them out. Brooke sent a longer message. She accused me of being ungrateful, of acting like I'd done everything on my own, of embarrassing them by pulling back right when people were paying attention. I read all of it once slowly. The words landed differently now, not because they were new, but because I wasn't trying to negotiate with them anymore. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about access. They hadn't wanted to show up when it required effort. Now that it offered attention, they wanted in. And when I didn't open the door wide enough, they framed it as rejection. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I closed the messaging app and went back to work. The decision in front of me needed resolving. I handled it. Then the next one, then the next. The familiar rhythm steadied me. By the time I checked my phone again, the messages had slowed. The initial pushback had burned itself out. What remained was a low-level tension, unresolved and hovering. I knew what would come next if I let it. More attempts to smooth things over, more reframing. more insistence that I was being too sensitive. I also knew something else clearer than I'd ever known it before. Their change in tone wasn't growth. It was adjustment. An adjustment only lasts as long as the environment demands it. I finished my coffee, now cold, and stood to refill it, aware that this was the point where patterns either reset or repeat. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was focused. The version of me they were reacting to now wasn't the one they'd ignored. It was the one reflected back at them through a screen. And I wasn't obligated to maintain that reflection for their comfort. I sat back down and opened a new document, not to write a response, but to outline what boundaries would actually look like if I enforced them consistently. Not as punishment, as policy. That felt like the most honest next step. I closed the document and didn't save it. Writing things down helps me think, but I don't need a script to know what I will and won't allow. The clarity had already settled. Boundaries aren't speeches, they're behaviors you repeat until other people adjust. My phone buzzed once, then again. I ignored it and walked to the window instead. Morning traffic flowed below, ordinary and unconcerned. The city doesn't pause for personal breakthroughs. It just keeps moving, which is useful when you need a reminder that life is bigger than one family conversation. At work, the day unfolded without ceremony. A briefing ran long. A plan needed tightening. Someone asked for my input and waited while I considered it. That waiting mattered more to me than any congratulatory message. It meant my time and judgment were valued without conditions. During a break, I checked my phone. A new message from my mom sat at the top. Shorter this time. She asked if we could talk later, said she didn't like how tense things felt. My dad followed with a practical note about dinner plans that weekend, as if proximity alone could smooth everything over. Brooke sent nothing, which was its own kind of statement. I replied once to all of them and kept it brief. I said I wasn't available for interviews or public posts connected to my work. I said I wouldn't be participating in stories about my childhood or family role. I said I'd reach out when I was ready to talk in person. No explanations, no justifications. The typing bubbles appeared. I muted the thread. Muting isn't dramatic. It doesn't block anyone or make a point. It just buys you quiet. I said it for a year, not because I planned to disappear, but because I wanted space long enough for patterns to either break or reveal themselves. The quiet that followed felt clean. That afternoon, a junior officer stopped by my desk with a question that turned into a longer conversation. We worked through it together step by step. When she left, she thanked me for taking the time. I nodded and went back to my screen. Mentoring doesn't look like guidance speeches. It looks like showing up consistently and letting people learn without being rushed. On the drive home, my phone stayed silent. I noticed how much easier it was to think without the background noise of expectation. No one needed me to manage their feelings. No one needed reassurance. The absence of that responsibility felt like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Over the next few days, pieces of information reached me indirectly. A coworker mentioned seeing my parents quoted in a small local article and wondered if I was comfortable with it. I wasn't surprised. I asked for the link, read it once, and forwarded it to our communications office with a short note clarifying my preferences. They handled it quietly. Systems work when you use them. Brooke tried a different approach after that. She sent a private message not in the group chat. She wrote that she felt shut out, that she didn't understand why I was being so distant now that it hurt to feel excluded from something important. I read it without responding. Hurt can be sincere and still not entitle someone to access. Later, she tagged me again in an old photo. I blocked the tag and sent one sentence back, direct and unemotional. I said I didn't want my image or story shared publicly. I said if it continued, I would block her account and ask my office to intervene. She removed the post. Consequences don't need to be loud. They just need to be consistent. My parents adapted in their own way. Messages stopped coming directly. Updates traveled through relatives instead. I heard that a clipping had been framed and hung in the living room, that my mom talked about me often at neighborhood gatherings, always skipping the part where she'd skipped the ceremony itself, that my dad wrote an email about how proud he was of raising a daughter who never needed much from them. I read those secondhand reports the way you read headlines from a place you no longer live. Mild interest, no urge to correct the narrative. At work, momentum continued. The recognition opened doors I hadn't knocked on. Not because I chased it, but because visibility removes friction. Projects moved faster. Requests came with clear authority. I used that leverage carefully, pushing resources toward improvements that would outlast my name on any list. I kept my routines intact. Early mornings, late evenings when needed. Mentoring sessions that focused on substance, not image. When interns asked how to balance ambition with burnout, I told them the truth. I said to build a life where the people closest to you care about the work long before anyone puts it on a screen. Sometimes a message slipped through the muted thread. I saw previews without opening them. Apologies wrapped in defensiveness. Invitations that assumed time would erase context. I didn't engage. Distance isn't cruelty when it keeps you honest. One evening, after a long day, I stopped by a grocery store on the way home. A stranger recognized me from the clip and said congratulations. I thanked her and moved on. The interaction lasted less than 10 seconds and carried no emotional debt. That kind of recognition is easy. It doesn't ask you to explain yourself. Back at home, I set my bag down and made dinner, the ordinary motions grounding me. The medal stayed in a drawer now, not hidden, just stored where it wouldn't demand attention. Objects don't deserve more significance than the work behind them. I thought about how different this felt from the version of revenge people expect. No confrontations, no dramatic ultimatums, just a recalibration of access. The people who had shown up when it mattered remained close. The ones who hadn't adjusted to the distance. The lesson wasn't that success changes people. It doesn't. It reveals them under better lighting. What you do with that information is the part that counts. I finished eating, cleaned up, and sat with a cup of tea by the window. The city hummed below, steady and indifferent. Somewhere my family was still telling the story their way. Somewhere else, people who had never known me were moving on to the next headline. I felt fine with both. I didn't need the version of me that only existed when validated by strangers. I didn't need to keep offering invitations that came with conditions attached. I'd built a life where presence was measured by action, not proximity. When my phone buzzed again, it wasn't from the family thread. It was a colleague asking for a quick read on a proposal. I replied, made a suggestion, and watched the typing bubble appear on the other end. That was the rhythm I trusted. Quiet work, clear boundaries, showing up where it mattered and letting everything else fall into its proper distance. 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 Its proper distance.